Chapter 2. Basically, what we'll be talking about here is kind of early slavery, early colonial stuff here. All right, so let's get right into it. American experiments from 1521 to 1700. Big topic right here out of the gate, chattel slavery. You need to understand that while slavery has been around since essentially the Neolithic Revolution, the slavery that we're going to focus on here in American history and early British history here is a chattel slavery, where slavery is seen as actual property. It's legally defined as chattel slavery in Virginia and Maryland, which are both southern colonies. The status of the child is determined based on the mother and not the father. This was a way to ensure that more children were in slavery. Essentially, it means if your skin is black and you live in those states, you're going to be a slave for the most part. This did run contradictory to English law. Children born to slave owners and slave mothers were automatically slaves. So if a slave owner had sexual relations with one of his slave women, and there was a child born from this union, that child is a slave. There's no question. Won't be raised as the owner's child or anything like that. That child, being half black, will be a slave. Now, again, Spain was here first. And so when we talk about Spain, we always talk about the encomienda system, which was their plantational system where they initially used Indian slave labor. But it was really hard on the slaves or on the Indians. And because they weren't immune to European diseases, they were dying in very high rates. This is going to help turn them towards African slavery. But it did create many social classes in the Spanish colonies. Mestizos were a mix between white and Indians. Mulattoes were a mix between white and blacks. Zambos were a mix between Africans and Indians. Many Spanish priests sought to convert the Indians. That's a big theme you should know. God, glory, and gold. There were many Spanish priests that were doing their best to convert these souls. They even tried to protect the Indians against conquistadors and rich aristocratic Spanish men. Columbian exchange, hugely important. You guys remember this from AP World. A massive exchange of goods, peoples, unfortunately diseases, but also ideas such as the Enlightenment are going to jump the pond, if you will, the Atlantic Ocean, and come over from Europe and make it to the Americas. There'll also be Africa will change dramatically as well. New crops introduced to Europe, potato and maize, which are enormously important. It's going to make the population explode in Europe because these are really good crops that are easy to grow. They're very tough. They make it through winters well. And so it's a really big deal that these food sources are changing sides. The horse, there were no horses in the New World prior to the arrival of the Europeans. The Spanish brought horses across the ocean with them, and it changed life. Some of these horses would escape. They would populate out in the wild, and you'd have wild Mustangs out there. So the Plains Indians, who hunted buffalo for everything, they became master horsemen, like the Apache and the Comanche. These great horse riding native populations. So horse was profoundly important. The natives of the Americas had no beast of burden other than the llamas of South America. In North America, it was the dog. That was it. And they're just not very good beast of burden. In some areas, up to 90% of Indian populations decreased. Again, we could have came over here and been really good people to the Indians. Wouldn't have mattered. They were going to die in large numbers anyway because of our diseases. Now, Spain is going to be the early birds over here, but they're going to get a massive Protestant challenge from Spain, or they're going to become a Protestant challenge to Spain. Remember, Spain is still heavily Catholic. We've had the Reformation going on in Europe, so we have a lot of religious discord, and the English have settled on Protestantism. So they're not going to be Catholic. And so these two heavyweights aren't going to like each other very much. But England begins to build up their navy. They will eventually in 1588 destroy the Spanish Armada. And really kind of from that point on, it's going to tip, the power is going to tip in the favor of the English. Mercantilism is an incredibly important term. It will be on your AP exam, so you must know it. But it's pretty easy. The system, basically, the idea is to make the mother country to support them it doesn't matter if it's at the expense of the colonies, that's fine. But you export more goods than you import. You sell more than you buy. That's the whole theory behind mercantilism. And if these mother countries can do that, they're going to be very powerful and prosperous. Plantation colonies in the Americas, they grow as a result of demand for some very popular items, sugar and tobacco, which are being grown in the Americas in high numbers. There is a huge demand for those back home in Europe. And because of that, it's going to, causation right here, it's going to build up the formation of the African slave labor. Some of this, especially with sugar, sugar slavery was the worst because sugar was very profitable. It was much more profitable than tobacco was. And because of that, in tobacco, if you were a tobacco slave, say in Virginia or South Carolina or something like that, they encouraged you to have children with slave women. And, so they could basically build up their, you buy a female slave, buy a male slave, they have children. Those are free sort of slaves for you. But in Brazil, it was just easier for them to buy rather than feed new slaves or women slaves or kid slaves. It was easier for them to just buy a new slave. The average lifespan for a slave in the sugar areas was only 21. It was incredibly brutal, literally worked to death. That is not the case in tobacco areas, even cotton areas. You would not have worked your slave to death because slaves were very expensive. And your profit wasn't nearly as much as sugar was. So again, Indian populations are going down, and so African slave labor is going to fill the void. They are going to, because there's demand, they are going to, for these products, they're going to become new slaves. Jamestown, 1607, first successful English colony. It was founded by a joint stock company. Basically, you have people, investors who go in, for 20% or whatever, and they share in the profits and the losses of the colony. If that ship sinks in the Atlantic, you're only out 20% of your money instead of 100%. So joint stock companies allowed, these investments in the New World. Originally, Jamestown was all men, and they're there for gold. They think they're going to get gold because the Spanish got so much gold from the Aztecs and the Inca. North America does not have the gold that Central and South America did. Eventually, though, however, under the leadership of John Rolfe, not John Smith, but John Rolfe, they're going to turn to a new cash crop called tobacco, and it's going to have enough profit that that they're going to be a successful colony before it. In Jamestown, 19 of the original people were actually Africans, but they weren't slaves, not in the beginning. It's not until a little bit later that the color of your skin is going to determine basically your freedom. Indian War of 1622, about a third of Jamestown's population was killed by Indian attacks. And because of this, the English did retaliate, and Jamestown would eventually become a royal colony in 1624. This meant that the colonists had to pay taxes to support the Church of England rather than just being a colony that worked, for the joint stock company. It gave them kind of more protection, but it made them beholden to England. Lord Baltimore, you need to know this man, and he settles Catholics in Maryland. He is English, and there is a minority of Englishmen who are Catholic. And so for them, the New World represents a religious stronghold, a safe place. So it's a proprietor colony. He literally buys the colony and sends Catholics to it to let them worship as they will. The Maryland Acts of Toleration granted religious freedom to Christians only and was again in favor of Catholics. So Muslims would not have been protected there. Heathens, like the Indians were considered, would not have been protected either. Maryland relied heavily on tobacco, just like the other Chesapeake colony, Virginia. So keep that in mind. Two southern colonies, tobacco was big, but founded for different reasons. Joint stock company for Jamestown and a proprietorship as a refuge for Catholic refugees. Okay, Caribbean islands, off the coast, down in the Gulf of Mexico, definitely focuses on sugar production. It's the big dog. Plantation life, It grew in part due to something called the headright system, which gave 50 acres of land to someone who paid for an immigrant's passage. This does benefit the rich because they get more and more land. So these indentured servants is what we used before we turned to slavery. You had a lot of people that were sitting, rotting in prison over in England because they owed money. Back in those days, if you owed money, they'd sent you to debtor's prison for it. So you could sign out of that. You could sign a 4 to 7 year contract, and you could get on a ship and you could come over to this strange, new, dangerous world. And once you served out your contract, you could actually own a land at the end of it. So, they're trying to settle. They want people to move to the colonies so they can make money off of them. So the people who have money, if you pay for an immigrant, then you get 50 acres of land. So that's fantastic. Like I said, in return for the passage, you work, it says 4 to 5 here, but up to 7 years as an indentured servant. But half of all the servants died before they became free. So it was a risky venture. Again, a lot of diseases, Indian attacks, things like that. It was a risk to come over to the New World. Indentured servitude was used extensively in the Chesapeake colonies in the 17th century. However, they run out of a supply of indentured servants, and they turn more and more to African labor. Africans were used more in Chesapeake due to Bacon's Rebellion, and it was cheaper than indentured service. We're going to talk about Bacon's Rebellion. It's an interesting story, but I guess we're going to focus a little bit more on that in class, or perhaps in another PowerPoint. But we'll talk about Bacon's Rebellion. The strict laws developed that promoted racism and regulated behavior of blacks. Them not being able to congregate in too large a group. Obviously could not marry white people. I mean, there were a lot of restrictions on blacks. Let me get these. All right, you see the map now. We're settling here, and here this is an Indian map. Cherokee, Catawba, Iroquois, Sioux. You got these Indian groups here, but we're going to take it off so we get it out of the way. And this one as well. There we go. New France. You got the French competitor to the English. They're going to land more northerly in Canada. Really it's simple to know. New France is based off the fur trade, and that New France is going to be single men, and France can never convince very many people to leave France to settle Canada. The weather's not nearly as nice there as it is back in France. It's not nearly as nice there as it is back in France. So you'll get some single men. Because of these single men, their relationship with the Indians, you need to know, is much better than what the English relationship is with the Indians, and even better than the Spanish relationship with the Indians. The Jesuit priests, you need to associate them with the French colony, with New France. They were excellent missionaries. They're out there trying to convert Indians to Catholicism because Jesuits were part of the Catholic tradition. You also have the Dutch. Now, the Dutch only had one colony in North America. It was called New Netherland. The capital of New Netherland was New Amsterdam, which is modern-day Manhattan, New York. Small colony, but it was a fur trading colony. And the Dutch were a little bit different than the others. They actually did not mind trading guns to Indians, whereas the English had strict laws and strict rules against trading guns to Indians. There were people that did it anyway, but if you got caught, you get in trouble. The Iroquois Indians were a confederation. They had 5 or 6 different groups in their confederation, and because of this, they had power. Because many of the Indian groups worked against each other. That made them weak before these European encroachers. So when the Iroquois spoke, the colonies had to kind of actually negotiate with them because they were dangerous. In the end, of course, we know the end of the story. European invasion will be complete. Now, New England, we talked about Southern slavery, cash crops. New England is not that case. The Pilgrims land in 1620. Of course, they came over on the Mayflower. Maybe you remember that from elementary. The Pilgrims are a separatist group. They believe the Church of England has become corrupt, and while they're Protestant, they are not Catholic. They don't believe that you can reform the church. Puritans believe that you can fix the English church. They're not trying to separate from it. They want to reform it. So these are 2 different groups. The Pilgrims land in Plymouth, and they start the colony there in Plymouth. The climate there is not as harsh as the Chesapeake's, and they got a very early representative self-government established. And that's important because eventually we know that America is going to turn towards that style of government. John Winthrop, very important test question guy. He is the proprietor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, and he has this vision of establishing a city upon a hill. This is another religious colony. Many of the early colonies were religious colonies, not all, but many. And he wants Massachusetts to be a city upon a hill for the whole world to look at. He wants them to be the role models. He wants people to see around the world what a good Protestant colony can be. He believed in predestination. At the moment of the beginning of time, it was already determined whether or not you go to heaven or hell. It's pretty harsh. Church members had tremendous power in Massachusetts. They were the only ones that could vote. And with Massachusetts, it's interesting. They are certainly not religiously tolerant. It's also very hard to become a member of their church. They're very exclusive there. And, this is where we're going to see the Salem witch trials later on. Very harsh, very male-dominated. Roger Williams, you need to know this man. He was formerly of Massachusetts, but he got crossways with other church leaders because he advocates separation of church and state. Again, Massachusetts Bay is a theocracy. It's a religiously run colony, and they won't have a separation of church and state. He also believed in religious toleration. He believes in friendly relations with Indians. All three of these things are going to get him booted. So Roger Williams is banished to this startup colony nearby, very small, called Rhode Island. There's no legally established church in Rhode Island because Roger Williams is basically the guy who runs the show in Rhode Island. He won't be the last person to get booted from Massachusetts. Anne Hutchinson's also a very famous one. She's seen as a threat because she's basically talking too much as a female. She challenged gender roles in the church. In the Puritan church, males went to church congregation at a different time than females. You didn't have mixed congregations. Very harsh rules in the Puritans society, which we'll explore further in class. She also had this weird idea that she could actually talk directly to God, which may not sound too strange to you, but in those days, Protestants didn't believe that you could talk, or Catholics believed that you could talk directly to God. You talk to your minister, your pastor, your priest, and they would talk to God on your behalf. She said she could talk directly with God. That's going to get her banished. And where's she going to go? Of course, she's going to go to Rhode Island. Now, like I said, I alluded to the Salem witch trials, which probably all of you have heard of at least. 1692, I believe, is when it goes down. You get this mass hysteria, and there's a lot of different theories of what really went on. It started with some girls over the summer, and some people think that they ate bad bread that made them see things. Other people think they were just bored teenagers who were being mean. They were being the mean girls, and then it got out of control and they got scared, and so they followed up their lies with more lies, and it ended up with 19 people being killed for being witches, including Giles Corey, who was he was a 70-year-old man. They wanted him to denounce his wife as a witch, and he refused to do so. So they put him on the ground, and they put a board across his chest, and they started stacking stones, telling him he needed to turn her in, and he refused to. And eventually, they put so many rocks on that it crushed him, and so he died that way. But many of the others were hanged. After the hysteria ended, prosecution for witchcraft finally declined. What ends it? Well, the girls go too far, and they accuse the governor of Massachusetts. They accuse his wife of being a witch, and he just shuts it down. He was playing along until then, and he's like, "No, this is ridiculous," and it's over. And just like that, boom, the witch trials were over. It's kind of after this that many colonists start to embrace the ideas of the Enlightenment, which is sort of an anti-religious movement. It's using logic and reason. I think people saw that there was so much hysteria because of the religion and church that it got way out of control. Now, New England has a series of Indian wars. Some of the more famous ones, the Puritan Pequot War, typically just known as the Pequot War. These Indians were allied with the Dutch, which means that they had access to guns. They had a lot of conflict with English settlers. English settlers have major conflict with the Indians because they're farmers. And to farm successfully, you have to clear a lot of trees. And most of the Indians did not do very large scale farming, and they were hunters. And so this made it hard for them to hunt because the English are cutting down so many trees. So it's a problem. 500 men, women, and children were massacred by the Indians. That's a large number for this time period. So New England retaliated harshly, and they did eventually gain the land. This is a brutal, nice, brutal little war. Some settlers saw smallpox and other diseases that decimated Indians as doing God's work, as John Winthrop would say. And so it didn't bother them at all that, they just see it as, hey, they're dying because they were going against God's children, us. Metacom's War, it's also a famous one that's usually talked about on the AP exam. It's just a year, and Metacom was derisively called King Philip by the English because they thought he was putting on airs, like he acted bigger than what he should have been. But he was a very excellent Indian leader. He was leader of the Wampanoags. He was a very good tactician militarily. And eventually, they can't get a hold of him. They hire other Indian groups, men from other Indian tribes to track him down and kill him because they couldn't do it themselves. And he was, he had a problem. He goes to war really because three of his Indians are killed over a religious matter that was pretty BS, and he'd had enough, and so he decided to go to war with the English there. But again, it's a loss. All right, here we go. Here's a little bit of Bacon's Rebellion. So Governor Berkeley is in control of Virginia. Jamestown is part of the Virginia colony. It didn't allow settlement past a certain line in the West, but there were already people living in the West, and those guys felt underrepresented in the local Virginia House of Burgesses in this representative government. Also, they're paying taxes, and they felt like their money wasn't being used to help them. You pay taxes, but they're not going to send anybody out there to help you fight Indians. They are saying, "Oh, you're going after too far, and you're stirring up trouble with the Indians. We're not going to pay for that." When all the good land was already taken on the coastline. Anybody that came after the first wave of settlers, you have to settle further onto the frontier, which puts you into conflict with the Indians. That's a very important thing to understand. And so Bacon just gets fed up with it. And he burns Jamestown. He runs Governor Berkeley out to his ship. Governor Berkeley has to escape to the ship out in the harbor to protect himself from being killed by Bacon and his followers. He's got a lot of people. He's a charismatic leader. He's got a lot of people following him. Unfortunately, he dies of dysentery. And so once he dies, the rebellion falls apart. Berkeley ends up coming back and establishing control. Now, significance, it's part of it's part of the reason why they start moving towards African labor. It also showed the tension, this is very important, between the rich and the poor, East and the West, because that's a theme that's never going to leave us for the rest of American history. Again, a few important topics. Club and exchange, I think you know that one. The headright system is easy for you to forget. Remember, if you sponsor an indentured servant over here, we're going to give you 50 free acres, but it benefited the rich. In the Chesapeake colonies, it's slavery based off of tobacco. New France was based off of fur. No religious toleration in Massachusetts Bay. You get the banishment of Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson. And then Bacon's Rebellion, again, showing that tension between the rich and the poor. All right, guys, that should get you a nice base of what's going on. And we'll go into more detail in class on this stuff.